All right, we're going to get started. Something's up with the internet, so we're not going to be able to live stream. So we'll have to just upload the video later. I'll get that in a minute, Dad. Okay. So go ahead and make your way in your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 7. This chapter deals with Solomon building his house and putting in some of the what I will call the furnishings of the temple, but it's not just the furnishings, but also typically you think about furnishing, you think about things that don't necessarily have to be there, but some of the things towards the end of the chapter are sort of the key items of the temple, at least of the worship of the temple, which is why. Again, those are things that have to be there. I do have some pictures, not as many as last time, because just quite frankly, not a lot of artists have spent time laying out necessarily the construction that's mentioned in chapter 7 compared to the temple. So we'll look at a few pictures as we move along through through this chapter today. Again, this is not going to be a chapter where you get a lot of application here. A lot of it's just detail, but we'll try to point out a few things about some of the details that are mentioned here. All right, so 1 Kings chapter 7 and verse 1. We're just going to go ahead and read down to verse 12. It says that Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished his entire house. He built a house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits, and its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. And it was built on 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams on the pillars. And it was covered with cedar above the chambers that were on the 45 pillars, 15 in each row. There were window frames in 3 rows, and window opposite window in 3 tiers. All the doorways and windows had square frames, and window was opposite window in 3 tiers. And he made the hall of pillars. Its length was 50 cubits, and its breadth 30 cubits. There was a porch. In front with pillars and a canopy in front of them. And he made the hall of the throne where he was to pronounce judgment, even the hall of judgment. It was finished with cedar from floor to rafters. His own house where he was to dwell in the other court back of the hall was of like workmanship. Solomon also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken in marriage. All these were made of costly stones, cut according to measure, sawed with saws back and front, even from the foundation to the coping, and from the outside of the great court. The foundation was of costly stones, huge stones, stones of 8 and 10 cubits, and above were costly stones cut according to measurement and cedar. The great court had 3 courses of cut stone all around, and a course of cedar beams. So had the inner court of the house of the Lord and the entrance of the house. All right, so basically all that is being described in verses 1 through 12 is that whether this was in the same time frame as the 7 years, if it overlaps as Solomon's building his palace, but more likely after he builds his palace. What you have in verses 1 through 12 is Solomon constructing his own palace, which there's a parallel account to this. If you look at 2 Chronicles chapter 4, you may have in your Bible where it overlaps a good bit. That's because 2 Chronicles 4 also deals with the construction of Solomon's palace. But here in 1 Kings chapter 7, from our understanding, it seems as though the house of Solomon was built pretty much right by the temple, which is what, if you look at this picture, that's what you have going on here. We talked about the construction of the temple last week. There's a little bit more details that are provided in chapter 7. But from our understanding, there's obviously, you had the outside court that surrounded the temple where the common person could come, and that's where they would bring their sacrifices, the different types of animal or food sacrifices. But then outside the court of the temple, that's where you had essentially Solomon's palace. Now, we know there in the verses that we just read that there are different houses or different halls, as the ESV has. They're different houses or different halls. Archaeologists are not exactly sure if this is all just one building with different different designations for buildings within inside the building, or if these are all separate buildings. This artist's rendition is that that these are all separate buildings. But again, you notice some of the places: Solomon in his own palace, the hall of the house of the forest of Lebanon, the hall of the pillars, and then Pharaoh's daughter's house. And so this is an artist's depiction of all these buildings. There's not a whole lot mentioned specifically about these buildings outside of this chapter. I know that we have mentioned here the hall of the throne, which more than likely is where Solomon handled judicial matters, which again would have been this building right here, connected to the temple, or at least on the court of the temple. One thing that I will mention for a moment is the house of the forest of Lebanon. There's a pretty good description there. And you notice here that this artist's rendition, you might note when you look at the text that there were windows in 3 tiers. A lot of people take that to mean that there were 3 stories to this building. So the three tiers of windows would represent 3 stories. Is possibly what that means. But the Bible does talk a little bit about maybe what specifically why this building was constructed. I want you to look for a moment, hopefully you have your Bibles, look for a moment at 1 Kings chapter 10 and verse 27. And then we're going to look at Isaiah chapter 22 and verse 8. So 1 Kings chapter 10 and verse 27. I'm sorry, that's not the right verse. Let's just go to Isaiah 22, verse 8. It may have been verse 17. Can you read that for us?
Kings 10, 17. He made 300 shields.
Yeah, that's it.
He made 300 shields of beaten gold, using 3 minas of gold on each shield, and the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon.
Okay, so again, the emphasis there is that you have being described here a shield of gold, that it was put in the house of the forest of Lebanon. Look at Isaiah chapter 22 and verse 8. There the text says that he discovered the covering of Judah, and thou didst look in that day to the armor of the house of the forest. So, at some point in time, it appears as though, maybe this was the intentional purpose of it, but it appears as though at some point in time, the house of the forest of Lebanon was where they kept a lot of military supplies, is what we gather from 1 Kings 10, verse 27, and Isaiah chapter 22 and verse 8. Obviously, in the case of Isaiah chapter 22, the recognition of them looking to the armor of the house of the forest, that would seem to indicate that that's where perhaps a lot of military supplies, maybe specifically connected to the king and the king's guard, were kept. And so, while it doesn't say that in 1 Kings chapter 7, potentially that's why this building was constructed, as a place to keep military supplies, which maybe gives us a little bit of more insight about what exactly the house of the forest of Lebanon was. With the house, or at least the hall of pillars, apparently what it simply did was it was sort of a walkway, or basically the entrance and exit that separated the house of the forest of Lebanon from the porch of the throne. Here's another picture, and again, this is a different artist rendition of this. This one looks a little bit different, where Solomon's house is a little bit more closely connected to this being the court of the temple, with the with the other houses mentioned built below that. Now, what you have here on the right is actually the work of archaeologists, I think from a few years ago, but however archaeologists date, how they go through the process of dating things, they dated the construction of this in particular being a wall in the back. They date that to around the time of Solomon. So perhaps what this area, which is still there in Jerusalem, was part of the wall that maybe was connected to a portion of Solomon's house, or the houses that were built, and then within inside it the ruins of maybe one of the houses as they were built, or even Solomon's house as well. But that's something that you can actually go visit today in Jerusalem. And it obviously, with it dating to the time of Solomon, also defends the proof, that the events of 1 Kings 6 and 1 Kings 7 happened, right? Because you actually perhaps have part of the wall still remaining. So the Hall of Pillars, perhaps connecting the two. The hall, obviously the Hall of the Throne, or the Hall of Judgment. Important, we know that Solomon was very wise and ruled judiciously. I know we talked about 1 Kings chapter 4. This is perhaps where people came to talk with Solomon, maybe where he conducted most of his work in this Hall of the Throne, or the Hall of Judgment. We notice verse 8 that he actually provides a special house to Pharaoh's daughter. Now we know, of course, from earlier in the book of 1 Kings, that Solomon did marry the daughter of Pharaoh. We talked about the reasons why that might have happened. A lot of times those type of marriages happen to try to form an alliance, or to try to maybe resolve conflict between two countries. Whatever the case may be, we notice that of all the women that Solomon would eventually marry, it was only Pharaoh's daughter that specifically is mentioned that here has a separate house, and like as this artist has a whole separate house that's away from the other house. Don't necessarily know maybe exactly why that's the case. It could have been that Pharaoh's daughter was probably the most prominent woman that he married, and based on prestige, perhaps that's why she got her own house. That would not have been uncommon for that to happen. But perhaps that's why Solomon builds specifically the daughter of Pharaoh a house. And obviously we know that Solomon's going to get in trouble later on because of his close ties to women from other countries when it comes to idolatry. And then verses 9 through 12, much like the temple, Solomon's house and the houses that he built are built with magnificent stones. That some of them were cut, as we know that Solomon hired people to come down to Jerusalem to cut these stones and to transport them. And so we notice that his house was very wealthy. Was a very wealthy. He had a very wealthy house. Would have cost a lot of money. So verses 1 through 12 basically describe Solomon's house. The rest of the chapter deals with all of what we will call the furnishings of the temple. And again, some of these are things that are actually necessary to the worship of the temple. But some of these, especially here at the beginning, are going to be sort of more of a fashion type of thing than it is perhaps maybe a necessity, especially with how it's designed. All right, so we notice verse 13. It says that King Solomon sent and brought Hiram from Tyre. He was the son of a widow of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in bronze. And he was full of wisdom, understanding, and skill for making any work in bronze. He came to King Solomon and did all his work. Now, this is not the same individual. This is not the king of Tyre. Right? The king of Tyre's name was also Hiram. He's the one who provided all the cedars of Lebanon and stuff like that. That's not the same individual that's being talked about here. This individual, I believe in 2 Chronicles chapter 4, is referred to as You'll see him referred to as Hiram. Other translations have it as Huram. But these are two separate individuals. You had the king of Tyre that sent all the supplies, but this Hiram mentioned here is going to be one who's going to do all the bronze work that's going to follow with what's being described here. So, after verse 14, basically from verses 15 to 22, what we have here are the creation of two bronze pillars. And these bronze pillars are going to be connected to the temple, as we're going to look at in a moment. Verse 15 says, he cast 2 pillars of bronze. 18 cubits was the height of one pillar, and a line of 12 cubits measured its circumference. It was hollow, and its thickness was 4 fingers. The second pillar was the same. He also made 2 capitals of cast bronze to set on the tops of the pillars. The height of the one capital was 5 cubits, and the height of the other capital was 5 cubits. There were lattices of checker work with wreaths of chain work for the capitals on the tops of the pillars, a lattice for the one capital and a lattice for the other capital. Likewise, he made pomegranates in 2 rows around the one lattice work to cover the capital that was on the top of the pillar, and he did the same with the other capital. Now the capitals that were on the tops of the pillars in the vestibule were of lily work, 4 cubits. The capitals were on the 2 pillars and also above the rounded projection which was beside the lattice work. There were 200 pomegranates in 2 rows all around, and so with the other capital. He set up the pillars at the vestibule of the temple. He set up the pillar on the south and called its name Jachin, and he set up the pillar on the north and called its name Boaz. And on the tops of the pillars was lily work. Thus the work of the pillars was finished. All right, so before we look at an image of these pillars, what direction did the temple face? The temple faced east, that's right. And so both of these pillars are going to be located. I know it says that one's located on the north and one's located on the south. But if we were to look at the temple, both of those pillars are going to be standing right there at the entrance to the temple. So this is what one artist has drawn out here, the 2 different pillars on the left. And again, a cubit's about 1.85 feet, almost 2 feet. So, we can do the math there and try to come to an assumption about how big these pillars are. Again, the name Boaz means in him is strength. The name Jachin means he shall establish. So we know what a pillar is, but some of these terms like capital and lattice and lily work and all that, at least from my perspective, I'm not really familiar what that is. I like this artist's depiction of it. It gives us an idea of what's going on here. Basically, all those terms are a way of making the pillar look fancy. Right, so you got the concept of lily work. You think about the concept of it looking kind of like a flower. That's the way perhaps that the top of these pillars look. Obviously, you've got the 2 rows of pomegranates. You've got the other bronze work that connects the 2 pieces. And what you have here is a lot of detail that went into this. And that also helps explain why Solomon brings in Hiram, who's known for his work in bronze, because he's had a lot of experience with this. Now, we could say that this also connects back to the time of Saul, where we remember that the Israelites at one point in time, at least early on under King Saul, were not known for their metal working, which maybe perhaps why Solomon would rather bring in somebody from another country who's done a lot of experience with this rather than to rely on his own people to do this. But these 2 pillars are basically representative. This is an artist's rendition of what's being talked about here. And so this is another image connected to it. Since the temple faced east, those 2 pillars stood outside the entrance to the temple, and so that gives us maybe a visual representation of what this looked like. But at this time period, to be able specifically to have all the details of the top portion required a lot of expertise to do that. We might think about it from the perspective of somebody who does construction, and there's something that separates a novice in construction from somebody that has a lot of experience with crown molding, right, and designing it. Most of the times we might buy it, or if you're putting up crown molding, you might buy it, but you're not actually making it yourself. But there are people that know how to make crown molding and make it really well, and that's kind of the idea of what Hiram's supposed to do here, because of his ability to handle bronze work. So verses 15 through 22, just talking about the two pillars that sat outside the temple, and that's more so perhaps what they look like, or what they looked like then. All right, so verse 23. That's kind of the fanciness of the temple, we might could say. What we talk about now in verse 23 are actual necessary components. So verse 23, it says that then he made the sea of cast metal. This is again a reference to Hiram, because this is working with bronze. Then he made the sea of cast metal. It was round 10 cubits from brim to brim, and 5 cubits high, and a line of 30 cubits measured its circumference. Under its brim were gourds for 10 cubits, compassing the sea all around. The gourds were in 2 rows, cast with it when it was cast. It stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. The sea was set on them, and all their rear parts were inward. Its thickness was a handbreadth, and its brim was made like the brim of a cup. Like the flower of a lily, it held 2,000 baths. All right, so what's being described here in 23 through 26 is this object right here. Now, do we know what the purpose of this object was? It held water, right? And it held water for washing. Why is washing important? The sacrifice is messy, right? Priests also had to go through the whole ritual cleansing process, right, to make sure that they were ritually clean, right? In order to offer sacrifice, the priest had to be ritually clean. And that's part of the reason why you had to have some type of basin where you had water to actually, for a priest to make himself ritually clean before he performed a sacrifice. So that's an idea of what that looks like. Here's another artist's picture of it. This one maybe puts it into a little bit more perspective, because this is actually a little bit of a rather tall object. You might know this picture might have it a little bit too tall, but you kind of get the idea of what this is. It's basically a huge bowl, and perhaps what you had here on the outside, it kind of hard to see, but maybe the engraving of gourds. We might remember that it was within the walls, or on the walls of the holy and the most holy place, right, that Solomon had carved gourds into the wall. Gourds were an object that was associated with fertility and prosperity. And so much like the fig tree in Hebrew culture, the gourds were also a very, were a plant. A gourd was a plant that was connected to the idea of prosperity. Now, underneath the basin itself, it says that there were 12 oxen, basically 3 faced in all directions. Perhaps that's a reference to the, a lot of times the concept of a bull being sacrificed was a very common animal that was sacrificed. Perhaps why the image of a bull is cast underneath it. I found this artist rendition kind of interesting, though, too, because if you notice here, the water from the basin's coming out of the bull's mouth. So I don't know if perhaps maybe that's the purpose that it served, because, if it was the case where the basin was up really high, how are you going to get water out of it? Well, you got to have some type of object to, at least to drain it out of, and perhaps there was a drain connected to this, and that's why the water comes out of the bull's mouth. And obviously, you had to have, a system of maybe what we would call an aqueduct system built to help transport water to put it into the basin. Which, again, the whole purpose of this is that it's there for the ritual cleansing. Now, in verses 27 down through verse 37, what we have described here are going to be these objects that the priests have right beside them. So, again, these are just a lot of details rather than, and maybe we stop here. We'll see. Verse 27, he also made the 10 stands of bronze. Each stand was 4 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, and 3 cubits high, which the stands, I'll pull this up here. These are 2 different ideas about what the stands are. I know we have this image here, but these 2 images as well. What you have here is the actual structure that this basin's going to set on. That's what's being described here. And that's another artist's idea perhaps of what that actually looked like. All right, so verse 27, again, he made the 10 stands of bronze. Verse 28, this was the construction of the stands. They had panels, and the panels were set in the frames, and on the panels that were set in the frames were lions, oxen, and cherubim. On the frames both above and below the lions and oxen were the wreaths of beveled work. Now, it may be hard to see, but in particular, you have those images on this, and you also have the images of the lion, the oxen, and the cherubim there on the sides of those stands. 31, its opening was within a crown that projected upward, 1 cubit. Its opening was round as a pedestal is made, 1.5 cubits deep. At its opening there were carvings, and its panels were square, not round, and the 4 wheels were underneath the panels. The axles of the wheels were of 1 piece within the stands, and the height of a wheel was 1.5 cubits. The wheels were made like a chariot wheel. Their axles, their rims, their spokes, and their hubs were all cast. There were 4 supports at the corners of each stand. The supports were of 1 piece with the stands, and on the top of the stand there was a round band 0.5 cubits high, and on the top of the stand it stays, and its panels were of 1 piece with it. And on the surfaces of its stays and on its panels he carved cherubim, lions, and palm trees according to the space of each, with wreaths all around. After this manner he made the 10 stands. All of them were cast alike, of the same measure and the same form. And so that's what you have being described here, is basically what I would call a rolling cart. You have the wheels on it, you have the decorations on the outside, you've got the top that has an opening at the top, and that's where verses 38 through 39, you've got the bowls where the water would be drained into. And it kind of makes sense why you're going to have these objects here, because, if you think about it just from a practical perspective, this basin, which, by the way, it says that in verse 26 that this basin held 2,000 baths. A bath, as a measure of unit, is about 6 gallons of an object. So that may not put into perspective that you're talking about 12,000 gallons of water in this, which is about the equivalent of a normal indoor in-ground swimming pool, how much water this holds. So the point is, you don't want to, if you're a priest and you have to go through the whole ritual cleansing process, you're not just going to cannonball in this thing, right? You're not going to jump in there because you're going to make the rest of the water dirty, and the way that it's constructed, obviously, you're not going to get out. You very well could drown, especially if you don't know how to swim. So you're not going to do that. So the reason why you have these wheeled carts that have a smaller basin on top of it is because it just is a lot easier to draw the water out, and you don't have to worry about the rest of the water being contaminated when the priest went through the cleansing process, right? Because that water would become contaminated. And so that's why you had 10 of these rolling carts surrounding the temple. That way, priests don't have to wait in line to use this, to clean it out, right? You've got 10 of them that are there. So again, that's a depiction of what that's like. Verses 38 and 39. We'll probably stop here. It says that he made 10 basins of bronze. Each basin held 40 baths. Each bath measured 4 cubits, and there was a basin for each of the 10 stands. And he set the stands 5 on the side of the house and 5 on the north side of the house, and he set the sea at the southeast corner of the house. And again, that's the whole purpose of these basins of bronze. It made it a lot easier for priests to be able to cleanse themselves and to be in the position where they could offer sacrifices. So that's why those objects were created. And again, why you have the opening at the top where you could put some type of container or a basin there to hold the water. Made it a lot easier for the priest to use. We're going to go ahead and stop here. Basically, verses 40 through 51 are going to deal with some of the critical components to the work of the temple, including the golden altar, the golden table of showbread, and things like that. And we'll talk about that next week. Are there any comments that you'd like to add on before we stop this morning?
Our baptistry holds about 1,000 gallons of water, so multiply that by 12 and you get an idea.
Okay. Yeah, that's a lot of water. If you didn't hear that, he said that the baptistry holds about 1,000 gallons of water. So 12 times the size of that baptistry was the size of this. Give you an idea of a reference there. All right, we'll stop here and we'll pick up in verse 40 next week.